Okay. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to everyone at the Beacon Project for funding this project and making this possible. I'm here to tell you about a project that I conducted with the following project team. So it involved me, I'm a philosopher, my name's Alfred Archer. My colleague on the far left there is Bart Englund, who's a political philosopher and a philosopher of economics, specialises in the ethics of nudging, which will be relevant later on in the talk. In the middle, we have Professor Alan Thomas, who was, like me and Bart, at Tilburg University in the Netherlands when the project began. He's now head of department at the University of York. He works in moral philosophy, virtue ethics, and in political theory. And finally, Niels van de Ven, a psychologist, social psychologist from Tilburg, or at least he was at the start of the project. He's now in the marketing department at Tilburg. He described it as going over to the dark side. I'll leave it up to you what you want to think about that. So what have we done with the money? Well, we've done this. We've published 5 papers, and we only promised 4, so that's good. Yeah, it was a bit of a challenge. I thought that the brief for today is to come up with a presentation that makes sense in itself, but also summarizes the work that you've done over the last 2 years. And the work that we've done can be seen here. I wrote 2 papers by myself, one on the nature of integrity and the kind of integrity we might think that moral exemplars have, trying to relate that to some findings in psychology. And the next one was on the moral value of compassion for this edited book on the moral psychology of compassion. And I was trying to think about whether a moral exemplar would be someone who has compassion, responding to arguments from Roger Crisp, amongst others. And then the more collaborative part, which is the bit I'm going to focus on today, are the papers we all wrote together. So first of all, we wrote a paper for the Journal of Moral Education, looking at the uses of moral exemplars in education and combining that by looking at the use of nudge strategies within moral education. And I'll tell you more about that later on. Then Alan, myself, and Bart wrote a paper on Joseph Conrad's novel Lord Jim, and how that might create a kind of problem for thinking about the use of moral exemplars in education and how we might respond to that problem. Again, I'll tell you more about that later. And finally, and a kind of excellent bit of good timing, we wrote a paper, a psychological paper of Niels, myself, and Bart, but really Niels, really. I mean, mainly Niels, because he's a psychologist. And that was accepted for publication 2 weeks ago, so it's really nice that it happened just in time for this workshop. Okay, I couldn't find a simple way to talk about all of these in detail in half an hour, so all I will talk about today are these 3 papers and try and tell you a story that kind of combines the work we've done in these 3 papers. Okay, so the kind of guiding question of this project in general, of the Beacons project, is what role should admiration for moral exemplars play in moral education and moral development? As I'm sure a lot of you know, a popular view that's been most prominently defended in recent years by Linda Zagzebski is that moral exemplars can solve as models to imitate. So by admiring moral exemplars, we are given models that we should seek to emulate and imitate their behavior. And the emotion of admiration is supposed to be crucial to this process. Through admiring exemplars, or through the emotion of admiration, we not only find out who the moral exemplars are, according to Linda Zagzebski, but also we get some motivation to imitate them, to emulate them. And so, in so doing, this will make us better people. By becoming more like moral exemplars, we become better ourselves. Okay, so the presentation I will give today basically takes this view and tries to think about how we could develop it further, or ways in which we could make this admiration for moral exemplars more effective. And also, in the last part of the talk, I'll consider a potential problem for this view, for the use of moral exemplars in moral education. Okay, so effectively I'm going to summarize the 3 papers I told you I was going to summarize at the start. So first I'm going to look at exemplar narratives and nudge strategies in moral education, how we should think about the relationship between the two, and how we could use nudge strategies to better use exemplar narratives in moral education. Then I'm going to tell you about the empirical paper that we wrote. And this is going to be the fun part, because I'm going to have to try and explain what the psychologist, my psychologist colleague, has done. And you might have to bear with me on that one. And finally, I will raise this problem that we see as posed by Conrad's novel, Lord Jim. So why this might create a problem for the use of exemplars in education. Okay. So let's start by talking about nudge strategies. So a nudge, as defined by Taylor and Sunstein, is any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives. Okay, kind of a long-winded definition, but the idea is that by using certain choice, or by framing people's choices in particular ways as informed by information from social psychology, we can predictably change people's options without actually constraining how they behave. So we can use knowledge of people's psychological mechanisms to steer people in specific directions without actually forcing them to act in those ways. So these strategies make use of automatic, fast System 1 processes instead of more reflective, slow System 2 processes to try and change people's behavior. And so the kind of nice example that people often give of a nudging strategy is an example of a cafeteria. So it's kind of well known that the items you put in people's eye line or right next to the checkout where they buy their food are going to sell better than other things placed in less direct parts of the cafeteria. So we could put some donuts right next to the checkout, we could put some donuts right in people's eye lines, or we can put some fruit in people's eye line and right next to the checkout. We know that whichever we put next to the checkout will be sold more than if we put it elsewhere in the cafeteria. So we can nudge people to eat more healthily by just putting the healthy food in the best place in the cafeteria. And this doesn't constrain anyone in any way. People are still free to eat as many donuts as they want. They just have to go to another part of the cafeteria to do so. But it will have the predictable result of meaning that more fruit is eaten and less donuts are eaten. Okay, so this is genuinely, or proponents of nudge strategies take these kinds of interventions in people's eating behavior to be less problematic than more openly paternalistic controls. So another thing you could do is you could put a tax on donuts, for example, and change people's economic incentives. Or you could subsidize fruit, changing people's economic incentives in order to hopefully push them to eat more fruit. But this doesn't change people's economic incentives in any way. All this does is change the way that choices are presented to people. So we're changing people's behavior, but hopefully in a non-paternalistic way. At least that's what the people who like this kind of stuff say. Okay, what does this have to do with moral education? Well, the first thing we argued in the paper is that, in a sense, the use of exemplar narratives in education is nudging. It is, or at least could be seen as a kind of nudge strategy. At the very least, it seems to make use of the following nudge strategies. So we're personalizing information. We're making information more personalized so that people can relate to it better, so that they can relate to it in terms they understand. We are framing choices in particular ways that hopefully will influence the things that people go on to do, the behavior they go on to perform. And we're rendering certain options more salient than other options. So by telling a kind of moral exemplar narrative, you're making the kind of morally good choice perhaps a bit more salient than you would if you described the situation in another way. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to claim was that there is a sense in which we can see the use of exemplar narratives in education as a form of nudging. The second thing we wanted to say was that if we think of it as a form of nudging, then it makes sense to look to existing nudge strategies or look to existing work in social psychology to think about how we could make these narratives, make this educative strategy more effective. So there are a number of suggestions we made about how this could perhaps be done. And we're not clear. So the first thing to say, I think, at this point is that many of these things are probably being done already. There's a common sense element to all of this, but this is just adding a kind of theoretical justification for it. So one is to include more affectively laden stories, stories that trigger people's emotions more, as these are stories are the ones that are more likely to be remembered. Another insight you could use is that role models are more likely to be inspiring when they are viewed by the audience as both relevant and attainable. So people that have lives that maybe are similar to theirs and are achieving things that are attainable to them. Another interesting finding is that the way in which you frame the behavior of a moral exemplar can affect how people respond to it. So if you frame an exemplar story in a way that makes people feel that they're being criticized in some way, then they can often respond with what Monan and his colleagues refer to as do-gooder derogation, where instead of wanting to improve their own behavior, they want to kind of criticize or find some flaw with the behavior of the exemplar. Okay, so all of these findings we think could be used to try and think about how these narratives are used in education. We could draw insights from these strategies to try and make the use of narratives in education more effective. Note as well that really that's the claim we're trying to make. It doesn't matter whether you think that any of these exact strategies that we pick out will work. Our claim is simply, look, if we're already engaged in a kind of a nudge process, then let's think about how we can do this more effectively. Okay. There are questions that could be raised, and perhaps will be raised, about whether the use of nudging in moral education is morally acceptable. I've decided to skip over those here, but I'll be happy to try and confront them in the Q&A if you've got them. All I'll say at this point is, if you want to read more about this part of the project, then this is the paper to do so. This is available online already. Okay. Now I want to move on to the second part of the project, which looks at the relationship between importance, surprise, and admiration. So the social psychology paper that we wrote together. So our goal in this paper was to investigate the kinds of things that would increase feelings of admiration for moral exemplars. So kind of drawing from the last part of the talk, if we think that there are ways in which we could make these stories more effective, make this educative tool more effective, then let's empirically investigate one or two ways in which this could be done. And we were inspired by quotes from Charles Darwin and Adam Smith, which linked admiration to surprise. So Adam Smith says that admiration is just a mixture of approbation, surprise, and wonder. So we wanted to look to see whether surprise was linked to admiration in this way, and also to see whether the perceived importance of an action was linked to admiration, whether it was a kind of precondition for admiration in some way. So we had two predictions. The first was the more important an action is perceived to be, then the more people will admire it, or the more intensely they will admire it. And the second was that the more surprising an action is perceived to be, then the more people will admire it, or the more intensely they will admire it. Okay, we're approaching the part where it's going to be very difficult for me. So what did we do? Well, we presented participants who we recruited from Amazon's Mechanical Turk with kind of 8 narratives showcasing morally outstanding behavior. We started with more, and then we kind of saw which ones people actually responded to and selected it from that. And then participants were asked questions about how important and surprising they found the stories to be, and how much admiration and inspiration they experienced. Okay, and this is the result. I'm just going to put this here for the psychologists to look at. If you've got questions about this, psychologists, I will happily note them down. I can't promise to be able to fully respond to them, but I can pass them on to Niels. But basically, we did find a link between surprise and admiration leading to inspiration, people being inspired to act in similar ways themselves. And kind of less, something we didn't expect is we also found this link between surprise, happiness, and inspiration. Thank you, was that okay? And this one I'm not going to try and explain at all. The upshot is that there was also this link between how important people perceived the action to be and how much admiration and inspiration they reported. Okay, here's the explanation that I do understand. Both importance and surprise affect admiration, that's what we found, which in turn leads to more inspiration, so people being more likely to feel inspired to act in similar ways. And as we saw, happiness was also important, and we had not predicted that, we didn't expect that. But this study, the first study, only looked at correlational relationships. We didn't have any intervention in this study. So then we did 2 more studies in which we manipulated for perceived importance and tried to manipulate for surprise by introducing more personal details into the stories to try and change how important people viewed it or how surprising they found it. And here are the results. Behold. The basic upshot is that we did manage to manipulate for how important people find the stories to be. So by introducing more personal details, both about the person performing the moral action and the beneficiary of that action, that managed to, or that had the effect of making people view the action as more important. And then when we did that, people were more likely to experience admiration and more likely to feel inspired to act in similar ways. So introducing these personal details did increase how important people viewed these actions, and that in turn increased admiration and inspiration. The effect on admiration was not direct. It seemed to go through the perception of importance of the action. But we weren't able to manipulate surprisingness. So we tried doing this, and basically we couldn't increase the amount of surprise people felt of the stories. We tried doing this in different ways by making kind of the helpful person have hobbies that might seem incongruent with the kind of action they were performing, but it just didn't work. So that is a limitation of the study. We were able to manipulate for importance, but not for surprisingness. Okay. I think I got away with that. So, what is the upshot of all this? Well, to relate it back to the kind of big story I want to tell in this presentation, it looks like by changing the way in which we present these narratives of exemplars, we can change how they are received by the audience. So if we want to adopt a kind of nudge strategy to this, the narratives of exemplars should be told in a way that emphasizes the importance and the surprisingness of the behavior. And we found that we could do this by introducing personal details of both the exemplar and the person benefiting from their actions into the story. I just said that. And then, yeah, the question we were left with is, if this is also true for surprisingness, we only found a correlational relationship between surprisingness and admiration. But if this is also true for surprisingness, then a kind of challenge for all the psychologists in the room is to how to try and manipulate these stories to make them more surprising, and then to see if that actually has the effect of making people admire the moral behavior more, and whether that also has the effect on inspiration. Okay, and you can see that explained much more precisely and accurately in this paper, which is not yet online, but is forthcoming in the Journal of Social Psychology. Okay, so I've talked so far about basically ways you could improve or try and improve the use of admiration for exemplars in education. I want to finish with a more negative, perhaps, note, and think about a potential problem with this idea of using admiration for exemplars in education. And I will do that by looking at the Joseph Conrad novel, Lord Jim. Has anyone read Lord Jim? No, no one. Good. The summary won't be boring then. Okay. Lord Jim is a story of an English sailor who dreams of being a hero. Here he is, trying to stand all heroic. And his visions of heroism are shaped by the kind of penny fictions he reads, so the kind of light literature with these kind of visions of heroic people performing heroic acts, and that's who he aspires to be. He aspires to be one of these heroes. So he dresses like one of these heroes, he stands like one of these heroes, he kind of models himself in this way. Dresses himself, holds himself together, in line with his vision of a hero, which is informed by light literature. Okay. And at several key points in the novel, Jim is presented with opportunities to behave like a hero. So at first, there's these two opportunities to act like a hero. In the first case, there's a couple of people who go overboard in the ship, and someone jumps into the water, or a couple of people jump into the water to save them and bring them back to the ship, and bring them back to safety. While all this is going on, Jim just stays rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to intervene, unable to help in any way. Okay. So you might think this would be a warning sign to Jim that he is not actually like the heroes that he sees himself as being like. That's not the case, though. Jim responds to the people who helped in this case with a kind of contempt. He's like, well, that's not real heroism. That was just a kind of small case. Nothing really happened there. When it comes to the big, proper acts of heroism, I will be the one who will be able to step in and intervene in these cases. And we are given an opportunity to see whether that's the case. Later on in the novel, the ship is is sinking. It has a crash of some sort and is sinking. And there's kind of a load of people in the kind of inner parts of the ship who are all going to drown unless someone tries to alert them and rescue them. Rather than doing that, Jim jumps off the ship and abandons ship rather than trying to rescue the people on board. And he basically spends the rest of the novel trying to kind of get further and further away, continually running away from people who found out about this, his abandoning of the ship. After kind of the vast majority of the novel is him kind of running away from this behavior, he then finds a kind of period of respect and happiness almost in a kind of Far Eastern island. And Jim is presented with another opportunity to play the hero when the village he's kind of a part of is attacked, and they demand that someone kind of put themselves forward to take responsibility for this attack taking place. And Jim actually takes up this opportunity to play the hero. He kind of steps forward and sacrifices his life in order to take responsibility for what has happened. So this seems, or might be read to be a sort of a happy ending, but the narrator of the book, Marlowe's verdict, is rather damning. So he says, we can see him, an obscure conqueror of fame, tearing himself out of the arms of a jealous love at the call of his exalted egoism. He goes away from the woman he was loving to celebrate his pitiless wedding with a shadowy ideal of conduct. So the idea is that the sacrifice Jim kind of makes of himself at the end is entirely pointless. And he's only doing it because he has this vision of himself as a hero that he needs to live up to. And he has found an opportunity for himself to be able to do that, even though it's not actually going to help anything. Okay, so what does all this have to do with the question of exemplar narratives in education? Well, I think the case of Lord Jim can be seen as a kind of fetishism of the idea of heroism. Someone who has kind of attached themselves to this idea of heroism and is intent on becoming a hero. But Jim admires heroes in a very superficial way. He kind of focuses more on the way they dress than on the actual actions they perform. And even when he's thinking about the actions they perform, he's more focused on the kind of heroic grandeur of the act than on the people that he might actually help in this way. So his focus is on spectacular cases of heroism, not on more everyday cases of just helping people. And importantly, there's no consideration of his own shortcomings. So even though he's given this first warning early in the novel that he may not actually be the kind of person he sees himself to be, he continues blindly on with the assumption that he is a hero, that he will be able to act heroically when the moment arises. And yes, as I already said, his concern is more for becoming a hero than it is for actually helping people. Okay, so this is a danger, I think, for, or this is a potential worry for thinking about how narratives might operate in moral education, because Jim is someone who's trying to become a hero. Jim is someone who admires moral exemplars and is attempting to emulate them. And in doing so, we don't get a case of moral success, we get a case of moral failure. Thank you. So, what does this tell us? Does this mean that we need to abandon the use of narratives of moral exemplars in education altogether? Well, unsurprisingly, I don't think that. I don't think that one novel can tell us that. But what I do think it might point us towards is that we shouldn't just look to narratives of moral success in moral education. We should also look to cases of failure. A focus only on admiration for exemplars might be distorting. It might lead us to think that acting in these heroic ways will be too easy, that everyone is the kind of person who can act in these ways. So I think there's also an important role for narratives of moral failure in education. We need to look at the ways in which people can fail to do the right thing, the ways in which people might predictably fail, and then use this in comparison with narratives of moral exemplars to try and show the differences between the two. Incidentally, Lord Jim is a nice novel for doing this. It's a good novel of the ways in which someone can fail to act morally, despite having, in some sense, praiseworthy intentions or goals. So this links to a point made by Warnock in his book Imitation in Education, who says that only through contrast can we appreciate the salient features of exemplars. And I think that's something we should be seeking to add to this idea that admiration for exemplars has an important role to play in education. Yes, I think it does, but we should also compare this to stories of people who fail or are examples of moral failure. Okay. And if you're interested in that, then you can, or you hopefully soon will be able to read that here when the book is published. Okay, so in conclusion then, in this talk I've tried to show how, to make the case that effective exemplar narratives should utilize nudge strategies in moral education. In a sense, it already is a nudge strategy to use exemplar narratives, and so if we're going to do this, let's do so more effectively. Perhaps by including personal details of an exemplar and the beneficiary to increase importance. At least that's what the one psychology paper that we wrote together, that's the upshot of that. But also trying to imitate moral exemplars can be the source of a distinctive form of moral error when people fail to recognize the ways in which they are not yet a moral exemplar themselves, or when they try and emulate them in a rather superficial way. And so this supports the need for narratives of moral failure as well as success in education. Thank you.
Education questions about the negative exemplars and the potential award.
Yeah.
Depending on how it gets clarified.
No pressure.
Yeah. So I really like the suggestion that we should use the negative exemplars in moral education. But then to clarify, what do you think is the primary function of the negative exemplars? So one way that I can see is, I thought that what we are originally suggesting is that negative exemplars help us reflect on our potential shortcomings, kind of for the good. I too can feel in this spectacular ways, so I should kind of watch out for that in my own life.
Yeah.
But then the last point that you made about negative exemplars made it sound like, no, what really is doing the work there is that looking at the negative stuff helps us see what's really important about the positive stuff. So which one is it? And then potential worry, if you go with the first route, then how do you combat this whole distancing? Well, I will never be like that.
So I would take them to play both roles.
Okay.
I'm not sure which I would say is the primary role, but yeah, I think it could play both roles. Does that still create the worry?
So if you want, what really we want people to do is not to be like a court Jeff, right?
Yeah.
But we all just, it like anytime you bring up this negative examples, nobody walks away thinking, oh my gosh, I too can do this. We all think, oh, what a horrible, person she or he is. They should have attended better to the negative exemplars.
Yes, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, maybe this is just someone who's read up on this stuff, but my perception when reading Lord Jim was like, oh, right, yeah, this is kind of giving us the message that all of us are kind of, maybe not to the extent of Jim, but all of us are, in a sense, deluded. We like to think of ourselves as these morally good people, but when the situation arises, we fail, and then we explain it away, we rationalize it in some sense. So we should perhaps be a bit more humble about this. But that might just be my reaction. So I agree that it's... No. Yeah, but maybe it's just because I was coming at it from this angle that I had that reaction. I don't know. Yeah, I think it is a worry that even if you use these negative examples, people will think, well, that's just... I'm one of the good ones, I'm not one of those. Yeah. So I don't have a full response of how we alleviate that. I guess if you're using it in an educative context, you could try and emphasize the fact that the message to take from this is not some people are like this, it's that some people are like this, and for all you know, it could be you. But yeah.
So I also think this idea of focusing on moral failure is really intriguing. I guess I'm curious as to what you are thinking about by moral failure. I presume you're talking about a case where a person is aspiring to act morally, but then doesn't end up executing on that, as opposed to a case where they failed to act morally, but they didn't really have any aspiration to do so in the first place. That to me the first case seems to be what's interesting about the Lord Jim scenario.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean? And
So
do you think that that's going to be more psychologically impactful?
I think moral failure could apply to both, but yes, in the Lord Jim, the more interesting point to note is that it's the... Wait, which way round did they come? It's the first way. It's the first kind of moral failure. So I think, yeah, of course, people fail morally all the time, but the interesting way about the way in which Jim fails is he fails by attempting to emulate his heroes. So I think the term can be used for both, but yeah, in the Jim case, I was thinking more about that more specific kind. But sorry, there was a last bit at the end which I maybe didn't respond to.
Would you just whether you think that kind of failure is the sort that is likely to be most educative as compared to a case where you just learn about somebody acting immorally but they had no aspiration otherwise?
Yeah, the short answer is I don't know. But I guess it maybe is educative in a way. I mean, maybe people, if it were the case that people tended to think that all they needed to do was set out the right intentions and try hard and then they would hopefully be successful, then this might be a particularly illuminating way of showing that having the right intentions and the right goals isn't always going to be enough. Yeah. But whether that's the most prevalent kind of moral failure, I don't know.
Thanks for your talk. Really enjoyed it a lot. Two-part question on Lord Jim. Given the work that Kit and others have done about whether literature can shape empathy or a theory of mind, pop literature versus classical literature being one important distinction.
Yeah.
Is there any difference between Lord Jim imitating the pop literature of the heroes in the novel versus thinking about a Conrad novel, for example, as a story? And secondly, I'm curious, given your mention of Marlowe at the end, to what extent is Marlowe being presented to us as an exemplar of perception, either a failure or a moral exemplar in that sense? And how does the narrator itself shape how we experience exemplar stories?
Okay, yeah, good questions. I was going to respond to the first one first, now it slipped my mind. The first question was about the...
Classic.
Yes, absolutely, yes. Yeah, no, I think it's no coincidence that Conrad talks about these, his heroes as all coming from light literature, and they all have this very kind of superficial image of what a hero should be like. And if you Google search for covers of Lord Jim, which obviously I did for this talk, you'll see that this is quite different from this. well, and this is maybe more interesting, nuanced. So yeah, I think, hopefully, you would hope it were the case that we can do better than these kind of really superficial depictions of what a hero should look like, and hopefully less superficial novels will be better at capturing the kind of complexities that come with trying to act morally, trying to be a hero. I mean, Lord Jim is a more interesting, more complex novel, although it doesn't depict someone who's successful. So yes, I think that's at least what the novel is trying to tell us. One of the things it's trying to tell us is that this superficial way of thinking about heroes can lead us astray. And so I think that would tie in nicely with the idea that actually more complicated, nuanced stories, richer material would be a better source for using in education. And the second question about Marlowe, yes, yeah, I think we're not supposed to just take everything that Marlowe says completely straightforwardly. I think there's definitely an element of unreliable narration going on here. But I think in order to fully answer that question, I'd have to reread it again to pinpoint the ways in which Conrad brings that out. But yeah, I think, yeah, although I just quoted from Marlowe and then drew a straightforward conclusion, I think actually there are reasons to doubt what Marlowe has to say as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks very much. This is great stuff. First, just a quick suggestion in response to Jeff's question. It seems to me that maybe one of the things that you might explore further is the idea of a character like Lord Jim, a negative sort of anti-hero, right, like Lord Jim. One of the ways in which that might turn out to be really effective in moral education is precisely because of how surprising it is that he has all of these good intentions and wants to be the hero, right, and then continually fails. So I wonder if surprisingness might work with the negative moral exemplars in something like the way that it works in the positive moral exemplar cases. And then the other, my main question was just, I'd like you to say something a little bit more about importance. When you say that, you know, the exemplar has to be doing something important, I'm just not sure exactly what we mean and how to draw that out, how to emphasize that. And insofar as you really emphasize the importance, at what point does it stop being a nudge? Start
Sure.
being something else.
Yeah. So on the first point, yes, I think it is an interesting use, or an interesting case where surprisingness has a big role to play. I mean, certainly the way Conrad sets Jim up at the start, you're kind of almost expecting it to be a tale of how he's a hero, and then things change. So yes. On the second point, yes. The idea was not to actually change how important the act should be viewed, but just how important it was viewed. So what we didn't want to do was make it look, to actually change how morally valuable the action was. Because then it's like, well, okay, people admire a more morally valuable action more. That's good, but not very surprising. Or very important, perhaps. So what we wanted to do was just change the ways in which people rated how important they viewed the action. And we did that just by adding irrelevant details about the lives of the people performing the action or the people benefiting from the action. So what age they were, what their hobbies were, what their occupation was, that kind of thing. Things that we didn't think really changed the nature of the action much itself, but it did change how important people viewed those actions. And so then we could draw the link between how important people viewed the actions to be and how much they admired the person who performed it.
I just have a follow-up to that.
Sure.
Do you find an equal effect for personal details about the actor, the agent, as well as the recipient? Or?
Good question. I can't remember. I'm going to say almost definitely not an equal effect. That would be very surprising.
Both independently predicted importance.
They both independently predicted importance, yes. I can't remember off the top of my head which was higher.
I can kind of see why details about the recipients might make the act seem more important, but what's the mechanism for personal details about the actor?
I mean, it might just be that people are able to, good question. I can't remember how much we spell that out in the paper. We do offer some explanations, or potential explanations. Perhaps by relating to the person more, by being able to connect to them more, they view what they do as more admirable or somehow more important. But yeah, the most honest answer I can give is I can send you the paper and you can see what we say. Sorry, that's kind of unsatisfying.
First, just a quick thought on Alina's point about the negative exemplars. If you're doing this, say, in a philosophy class, what I think sort of works is throwing in a bunch of Confucianism, because the Confucians are saying all the time, you know, if you see something really great, look within yourself and see how you measure up. If you see something really awful, look within yourself and see if you're that way too. So maybe if you precede it with some Confucianism, the exemplars would, the negative ones especially, might be more effective. And I think maybe you just started to answer my question, but it was about the surprisingness.
Yeah.
So I've tried out surprisingness sort of accidentally on my own students. Few things can surprise a room full of college seniors, right? But some of my exemplar stories do, but I think it's because what they did was inherently surprising. But what you did was try to manipulate the surprisingness as well with the irrelevant, as you say, personal details rather than the surprisingness of the action itself.
Yes.
Okay.
And we failed. People didn't find it any more surprising, or at least not statistically significant.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Corinne, did you get your own question?
I did, yeah.
You're up for the holding the ball on the net.
I also had a question about surprisingness.
Yeah.
My impression was that you're getting people to rate how surprising they found the act, and I was thinking that they might be thinking of surprisingness in different ways. Some might be thinking of how surprising it is that this person did this act, given what I know about people generally and what people generally might do in this situation. And then someone else might be thinking, well, how surprising is it that this particular person did this, given what I've been told? And then it looks like the more you tell about the person's personal details, it starts to become like unsurprising that the moral exemplar does this. And I'm wondering if that has some influence on the ratings of surprisingness, and if you try to craft, maybe you can tell the story in such a way that you're saying you make some comments about what people generally would do or something like that, and it might make a difference.
Yeah, or ask the more focused question of how surprising do you find it that this person did this act? Yeah, that perhaps that's a way. Perhaps that would have a different result. And the only way to find out would be to run it again with that more specific question or the altered story. Yeah, but thanks.
You get the last question.
Okay, thank you very much for this. So my question is about something that happens in the nudges paper that you said you were open to discussing in Q&A, which is about the ethical dimension.
Yeah.
And the study on surprisingness and importance is super interesting in connection to that, because one of the problems is like, you know, are you manipulating people at the subconscious level in a way that's, you know, paternalistic or something like that? But if what you're doing with the stories is changing their control of the situation or control of the action, or changing their thoughts about what's going on, and then subsequently their ways of seeing situations that they're in, that's not straightforwardly like changing their behavior in an automatic way. It's changing something that precedes behavior. And so maybe giving them new reasons, new practical reasons for acting in one way rather than another. But that seems to leave the actions up to them in a way that like other kinds of automatic nudges don't. And so I wondered if that can respond to some of the ethical problems people might raise.
Right. So that would be almost saying that it's there's a problem with the nudges that involve kind of automatic changes in behavior that people may not even register, but maybe we should worry less about predictable changes in the way people respond to stories, which then has an indirect relationship to how they behave. Yeah, that's a nice thing to add to the things we said in the paper. I wonder if why am I creating problems for my own view. I don't know. But if I was trying to do that, I would say this. So yeah, a critic of nudging might say, well, look, even in the cafeteria case, what's happening is that you're predictably processing the choice in a different way than if we set up the choice in a different way. And yeah, maybe, I guess that my worry might be that trying to say what is a direct influence on behavior and what is indirect might be kind of complicated and hard. But yeah, I like the thought that perhaps even if you accept all of the normal criticisms of nudging, maybe they don't apply in this case. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.